Why are we in a universe where everything has to eat something else in order to survive?
2 miles beneath the ice of Antarctica, something is buried that the United States government has spent 80 years making sure you never find out about. Linda Moulton Howe knows what it is. For 25 years, men who saw it with their own eyes have been calling her in secret. Navy engineers, geophysicists, a NORAD officer with the highest clearance the country issues.
Mainstream geologists have long believed that ancient humans never settled on Antarctica because of its hostile climate. But incredibly, satellite images revealed a curious formation emerging from the ice.
They told her the same impossible thing. They handed her coordinates. And one by one, before the rest of the world could hear them, they started dying. What they saw down there is disturbing, and it is real. The first witness. 16 years later, that same flight engineer would pick up a phone and call a journalist named Linda Moulton Howe. But to understand why he waited so long to speak, you have to understand what he was looking at out there on that ridge. Antarctica was first sighted in 1820 by Russian explorers. For more than a century afterward, it was a blank space on the map. Endless ice, killing winds, a continent so hostile nobody bothered to ask what was actually underneath all the frozen ground. By the late 20th century, that began to change. Aircraft started crossing the interior, research bases pushed deeper inland, and in 1982, a routine U.S. Navy supply mission lifted off from McMurdo Station, heading toward a remote camp deep inside the continent. The flight engineer on board had done this run before. Standard procedure, brutal weather, but expected. Then something failed in the equipment, and the pilot had to put the aircraft down on a ridge. The crew got to work on the repair, racing the cold, but the flight engineer kept looking out across the ridge, because the shapes he could see in the distance did not match the landscape. Ice does not form clean lines. Snow does not carve sharp angles. He moved closer to get a better look, and what he saw stopped him completely. Part of a massive structure stood exposed where the wind had stripped away layers of ice. It was solid. It was shaped. The surface was not rock. The surface was not ice. It looked like something that had been built, with purpose, with intention. Before he could move any closer, the radio crackled. The crew was ordered back to the aircraft immediately. They lifted off without a word. And here is where things get strange. When they landed back at base, intelligence officers were already waiting on the tarmac. The crew was separated. Each man was questioned alone. The flight logs were seized and stamped classified. Non-disclosure agreements were placed in front of every person on that flight. And then they were given one final instruction. This never happened. The flight engineer kept that promise for 16 years. He carried it through retirement. He carried it into his 70s. And then, in 1998, with time running out, he made a call to Linda Moulton Howe, the Emmy-winning investigative journalist who had spent decades documenting eyewitness accounts that mainstream media refused to touch. She listened. She recorded every word. She pulled his service record. She verified his background. Everything matched. The man was real. The mission was real. The dates lined up. But Linda also knew that one witness, no matter how credible, was not enough to prove something this enormous. So she filed his testimony away and kept it private. She had no idea what was about to come next. I have to stop here for a second, because most of the men you are about to hear from are dead now. They came to Linda because they did not want what they saw to die with them, and the only reason their words still exist is that she wrote them down. So if you want this story to keep getting told, hit the subscribe button. That is the entire reason any of this is reaching you right now. The strange pattern. Over the following 20 years, more people found their way to Linda Moulton Howe. They came from different branches, different sciences, different countries. None of them knew each other. None of them had ever spoken about what they witnessed. And every single one described the same impossible thing. The first call came from a geophysicist who had run ice-penetrating radar surveys across Antarctica. He told Linda he could still remember the exact moment the readings came back. Massive empty spaces deep beneath the surface. Not natural cracks, not ordinary caves. Shapes that were too regular, too geometric, too organized to be anything the planet had made on its own. He walked the printout to his supervisor. He described his supervisor's face when he saw it. the way the man went quiet, the way his eyes moved across the page once, then again. And then he picked up the phone without saying a word. Within hours, the data was classified and pulled from every system the team could access. The team itself was reassigned by the end of the week. They were told, in plain language, never to speak of what the radar had shown them. A Navy Seabee from a construction battalion came forward next. No briefing, no explanation, just one order: drill straight down. When they reached the bottom of the shaft, he saw smooth metallic walls, surfaces too perfect to be natural. He stood there in the dark and felt something he had never felt on a job site before. He felt fear, because something had built those walls. A scientist from Argentina's Esperanza Base reached out from the other side of the world. Ice cores dated more than 12,000 years old. Objects that did not belong. Military personnel arriving within hours every time, taking the samples, leaving no record. And a pilot called her about a restricted zone over Antarctica that did not appear on any map, with one supervisor offering only 2 words of explanation: sensitive research, before telling him to stop asking. Witnesses who had never met. Witnesses with no way of coordinating their stories, and every account pointed in exactly the same direction. Something massive, something structured, something deliberately hidden beneath the ice. This was no longer one strange event. This was a pattern. And in 2016, the man who would finally tell Linda what that pattern actually meant picked up a phone and dialed her number. The buried structures. The man on the other end of that 2016 call was a retired NORAD officer. He had held the highest levels of classified clearance. Linda would later describe him as the most credible source she had ever interviewed in her entire career. And what he said in that first call broke open everything she had been chasing for 2 decades. Beneath the West Antarctic ice sheet, at a depth of roughly 2 miles, there were structures that did not belong to nature. Not rock formations, not ice geometry, built forms, shaped with precision. And then he told her something that shifted the floor underneath her feet. These structures were older than the ice covering them. They had existed before the last ice age, more than 12,000 years ago, back when Antarctica was not frozen at all, when the continent had rivers and forests and a climate that could support life. Whoever built those places built them in a green Antarctica that no living human has ever seen. He told her the anomalies had first been detected during Operation High Jump, the 1946 to 1947 mission led by Admiral Richard Byrd. The official story was always that High Jump was a training and research operation. The classified data told a different story. Seismic surveys had picked up signals deep under the ice that did not match anything in the geological record. The signals were logged, they were never released to the public. Over the next 70 years, the United States, Russia, and eventually China returned to those same locations again and again. The officer was very specific about this. These were not research missions. These were recovery operations. Teams were not just studying the sites, they were extracting things from them. Some areas were reached through natural ice caves. Others required deep shafts drilled through miles of frozen rock. And what they were pulling out was not small. He described an extended complex that he could only compare to a buried city. Some of the recovered objects, he said, still functioned. Researchers could not explain how the devices worked. They only confirmed that they worked. The items were transported to classified facilities for ongoing study. Linda asked for proof. He gave her coordinates. He gave her internal documents with redacted sections. He gave her project names tied to those exact locations. For Linda, this was the moment everything she had been collecting finally clicked into place. But one question still hung in the air. If these structures really existed 2 miles beneath solid ice, how were people actually getting down there? And what did they see when they did? The drilling operation. The answer came from a military contractor who had worked on a classified drilling operation in 2003. His team had been told only that they were accessing a geological anomaly. He described the descent through the shaft, the walls turning from white to deep blue as the surface light shrank above him into a small, bright circle, and then disappeared completely. Total darkness, except for the lights on his equipment. Then the ice ended. Not gradually, suddenly. He stepped off the platform onto open ground inside a space that was vast, far too large to be natural. And on the walls around him, he saw markings, symbols, patterns that did not match any writing system anyone had ever recorded. His team stood in silence. And then, ahead of them in the wall, he saw a doorway, an entrance leading deeper into something else. He wanted to step through it. He did not have the clearance. Only personnel with the highest authorization were allowed past that point. He watched as scientists and military operatives prepared to go inside, and then he was pulled back to the surface. Years later, dying, he told Linda one sentence she has never forgotten. "People should know we found something down there that changes history." The recovered evidence. So now Linda had a picture of how the teams were getting in. The next question was what they were bringing back out. A satellite imagery analyst told her he had seen unusual shapes in raw Antarctic images, shapes that were blurred or scrubbed completely before the data was ever released to the public. Someone was cleaning the photographs. Someone was deciding what the world was allowed to see. A materials scientist who briefly examined samples from the recovery operations told her the substances did not match anything in any known database. He could not identify them. Nobody could. A logistics coordinator who worked with the National Science Foundation's Antarctic program told her about equipment manifests that had no business attached to a research mission. Heavy excavation gear, sealed containers, transport routes that trace back to the Department of Defense, not to any university lab. And electronic equipment, multiple witnesses told her, consistently failed when it got close to certain locations on the continent. By 2020, Linda Moulton Howe had collected more than 15 credible testimonies, verified coordinates, cross-referenced details, service records that matched, operations that lined up. And then her witnesses started dying. The retired NORAD officer passed away in 2022, the most credible source she had ever interviewed, the man whose first call had broken the entire case open. Gone. Linda realized she had become the last person holding all of this together. If she waited any longer, every account these men had trusted her with would die with her. In a 2023 interview, she put it plainly. She said she had a responsibility to make sure their testimonies survived, because if she did not tell the story completely, with every detail and every source she could responsibly name, it would simply disappear. In late 2023, she began compiling what she called her comprehensive Antarctic report. Every testimony, every coordinate, every operation detail. 25 years of investigation pulled into one document. In early 2024, she released portions of it through earthfiles.com. She published the coordinates witnesses had given her. She published the declassified Operation High Jump materials, with their redacted sections still intact, and she invited the public to verify the evidence themselves. The response from every government involved was the same. No denials, no confirmations, no explanations, only silence. And to Linda, that silence said everything that needed to be said. Something has been hidden under the ice of Antarctica for a very long time, and the people who know what it is have decided that the rest of us are not allowed to know. So now I want to hear from you. Do you think these witnesses are telling the truth, or is there another explanation for what they saw down there? Drop your answer in the comments, because I read every single one. And while you are thinking about it, click the next video on your screen right now, because what I am about to show you connects directly to everything you just heard, and it might be even harder to explain.